Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a fascinating piece of history that is absolutely going to rewrite a narrative you probably thought you knew inside and out. When most of us think about Brazilian sports, and specifically Brazilian football, our minds immediately jump to this idea of spontaneous, natural flair, right? We picture a sporting identity that was just born organically on the beaches or the streets, driven by this inherent indigenous spirit. But what if I told you that the foundation of this global powerhouse wasn't entirely a homegrown phenomenon?
It really begs the question, who actually built Brazil's organized sports culture? To really get to the bottom of this, we have to challenge that myth of purely indigenous origins. The truth is, the foundational layers of Brazil's massive sporting infrastructure were heavily constructed by what researchers call the silent architects. We're talking about transnational immigrants who arrived in Brazil and systematically laid the groundwork for the modern sporting superpower we see today.
Let's set the stage with Part 1, Contextualizing Time, the Post-Abolition Era. Okay, let's dive into this timeline. In 1888, Brazil officially abolished slavery. Now, moving away from an agrarian slave economy meant the country desperately needed to repopulate its vast territories and stimulate economic development. And this sparked a massive influx of literally millions of immigrants. By the late 19th century, we're seeing huge surges of Europeans arriving, Italians, Germans, the British. And then, by the early 20th century, a highly significant wave of Japanese immigrants arrived as well. But here is what's absolutely vital to understand. They didn't just bring their labor. They came from societies that were rapidly urbanizing and industrializing at the time. So they brought these deeply ingrained cultures of structured leisure time, physical education, and organized sports right along with them.
Moving on to Part 2, Why Build Clubs? The Immigrant Motivation.
Now, you might be wondering, why on earth would people who are struggling to navigate a brand new, totally unfamiliar land prioritize building recreational sports clubs? Well, these clubs were far more than just places to play games. They were essential survival mechanisms. Imagine arriving in a foreign country with a different language and totally unfamiliar customs. These clubs provided crucial cultural preservation. They were a safe haven to speak native languages and celebrate homeland traditions. They offered social cohesion and mutual support, basically acting as a critical safety net to help newcomers find jobs and navigate local prejudice. But crucially, they also offered a path for controlled assimilation, allowing these immigrants to gradually integrate into Brazilian society while getting economic and social advancement. Honestly, it was a brilliantly strategic way to adapt.
Let's get into the specifics in Part 3, 4 Immigrant Sporting Legacies, Mapping the Origins.
It's fascinating because different immigrant groups embedded their distinct homeland values right into Brazil's recreational fabric. For example, the Germans brought discipline and order, introducing things like gymnastics, shooting, and swimming. The Italians, on the other hand, brought immense community pride and passion, and they were the ones who really took football to the masses. The British, who were operating largely as expatriate professionals, brought a sense of exclusivity and strict etiquette with sports like rugby, cricket, and the initial introduction of football. And then you have the Japanese, who brought deeply philosophical and ethical frameworks through martial arts and baseball. Each group uniquely colored the sporting landscape we know today.
Let's zoom in on the Germans for a second. They'd established something called Turnverein. Now, these were gymnastic societies, but they functioned as comprehensive social and cultural centers. By establishing these clubs in growing cities like Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, the Germans laid the methodical, structured foundation for physical education in Brazil. It wasn't just about fitness for them. It was about discipline and communal well-being, the whole shebang.
Now, we see a really stark contrast in how sports were adopted when we specifically look at football. The British introduction provided the strict rules, the equipment, and the initial framework, but it was all through these elite, socially exclusive expatriate clubs. Conversely, the Italians completely transformed football. They infused it with intense passion, a highly improvisational style, and, most importantly, working-class mass appeal. They literally turned an aristocratic pastime into a deeply democratic mass movement that spread like wildfire.
And to understand why this matters to you today, consider this. These early Italian immigrant clubs are the direct ancestors of today's massive Brazilian football powerhouses. The club Palestra Italia, that evolved into Palmeiras. Associación Atlética São Paulo was incredibly instrumental in forming São Paulo FC. So you see, these aren't just dry historical footnotes. They are the literal foundations of modern global football giants.
We also absolutely cannot overlook the Japanese legacy. Down in regions like São Paulo and Paraná, Japanese immigrants constructed dojos. But these weren't just simple training halls. They were robust cultural centers that cultivated judo, karate, and baseball. They pass down complex philosophical frameworks and ethical disciplines right alongside the physical training, adding yet another incredibly rich layer to Brazil's sporting diversity.
So how did they pull it off? That brings us to part 4, how the clubs were built, methodologies of establishment.
Building sustainable institutions from scratch in a brand new country obviously required a very clear methodology. Step 1, they had to mobilize community leadership, often leaning on existing church leaders or prominent merchants. Step 2, they pooled their often meager resources and utilized collective community labor to literally build the pitches and halls with their own hands. Step 3 is cultural adaptation, which we're going to look at much closer in a second. And finally, step 4, they strategically secured local Brazilian alliances and patronage from wealthy landowners or established leagues just to gain some much-needed legitimacy.
Okay, so that crucial point in step 3 is summarized by this amazing concept, syncretism. If there is one big thing you should take away from this explainer, it's this. These silent architects didn't just copy and paste their homeland cultures into Brazil. They actively blended their sporting traditions with Brazilian rhythms, the local climate, and existing social structures. They adapted. And that syncretism, that beautiful, messy cultural fusion, was the real secret to the survival and massive, enduring popularity of these sports.
Let's look at the big picture in our final section, the enduring national legacy, from immigrant clubs to national pride.
When you stack up these enduring impacts, the sheer magnitude of their contribution becomes so clear. These immigrant clubs actively broke down social barriers, leading to the democratization of sport for the everyday masses. The intense pride between these different immigrant communities ignited fierce local rivalries, which in turn demanded better training and tactics, basically fostering the highly professional environment we see today. Ultimately, they enriched a unified national identity and created the very foundation for Brazil's undisputed global sporting dominance.
I really want to leave you with this powerful quote from the research. Brazil's sporting culture is a heritage that is as much a product of transnational influence as it is of indigenous spirit. It just perfectly summarizes that Brazil's identity isn't just one thing. It's an incredible, dynamic melting pot of global influences. It is a true testament to the resilience of immigrants and the uniquely welcoming, adaptive nature of Brazilian culture.
Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought to ponder. If Brazil's iconic sports culture, something the whole world recognizes as uniquely and distinctly Brazilian, was actually built by silent architects from across the globe, what other celebrated national traditions around the world are actually transnational masterpieces just waiting to be uncovered? Something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time.